Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Our guest is a most distinguished economist, and I see there are many of you coming to listen to his lecture. Many people are following this lecture also from other halls. We're all very eager to listen to this presentation. We all know what the sharing economy is part of this platform economy that has been brought about by the digitalization of services. Platform economy is that of Amazon, Facebook, Google, and part of this economy, which is based on digital platforms, has enabled us to share things that we might not use 100%, such as Airbnb, for example, is a case that we're all familiar with, and we're all familiar with, and we use it as well, so much so that we can, for example, rent part of our house or our house or the house that we only use partially. BlaBlaCar, such as Lyft, is something that enables you to drive somebody who can share the cost of the drive. So sharing economy is something that is very easily found in transport. It's very part and parcel of our contemporary culture in the 21st century, much less so in the 20th century. In the 20th century, ownership was something that was very much sought after, so nobody was very willing to share. So if somebody was asked to host somebody, that would have been something that would have made your property rights less exclusive. But now this stage is over. Thanks to this digital platform, we can use such extra capacity, having information also on the ranking, on the reputation of the people that are being hosted, and the people that play host to other people. So the sharing economy is very interesting in that it generates jobs, or perhaps work that can produce income that can add to additional jobs. Uber, for example, is very successful, as is Taskrabbit in the US. Taskrabbit was funded by somebody who meant to share her babysitter, and then it started sharing other parts of gigs, and this platform is now being developing also in Italy. Gnammo, for example, in Italy, is an Italian app, something that has been founded in Italy so as to share dinner. So, for example, you can prepare some food and invite somebody over so as to get some money and share whatever you have prepared. And there are many such examples of sharing that has been made available thanks to digitalization. Professor KRUEGER is now going to hold a lecture on the sharing economy, and I believe that he's also referring to the digitalization and the platform, the digital platform, transforming labor market, creating new forms, new shapes of labor, and creating new opportunities to find jobs. Professor KRUEGER is one of the most distinguished economists, is one of the top 50 economists worldwide, so he's greatly influential. He can boast a quite past. He is a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University, where he has founded the Princeton University Survey Research Center. This is very interesting, as I was saying, because one of the main features of Professor KRUEGER as an economist is that, based on what I've read, based on his publication, he is not an economist that just uses his magnifying lens as an economist studying models. He's also studying the real life. So much so that he has studied some mechanisms, some formula to put together surveys and to distinguish current phenomena at best. He's also had public posts. He was the Undersecretary in 2010, and he was an Assistant Secretary for the Economic Policy and Chief Economist of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He was also Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Clinton administration. He is also the author of most interesting books and focused on labor, but another focus of his is the relationship between training, education, vocational training, and work. I believe that his recent book was written on terrorism, on the economic basis of terrorism. Usually we believe that terrorists come from the outcasts, but as a matter of fact, terrorists are proven here to be people with an education and with sound families. So the subject matter of his research are very much connected to the word of labor, distribution of wealth, and education. These are perhaps the most important focuses of his research. He has carried out important research on the structure of salaries and wages, on the impact of minimum wage on employment. Apparently, there's a close relationship between minimum wage and employment, and the research were carried out in the different U.S. states with different minimum wages, proving that employment was created when the minimum wage was higher. He also studied the impact of computer on the structure of wage, and he also studied the quality of education in school as a function of the wage earned, with a specific study on how research in real things. Indeed, he studied, for example, the size of classes and the impact of that on the quality of education, and he's also carried out other research symmetrical to this major idea on the rock economy, on pop music. A most recent study that is probably yet unpublished, the latest version dating back to April 2025, takes us straight to our subject matter today. Indeed, he analyzed the atypical jobs, as we might term them in Italy, alternative work arrangements as they are defined in the US, between 1995 and 2015. In this research project, many things emerged. Among other things, the atypical contract, as we term them, grew by 50% in this time lag. So they used to be 10%, and they grew to something more than 15%. This means that all the increase in jobs that were created between 2005 and 2015, some 9 million units, was due to such a typical contract. In this survey, we learn that 0.5% of workers find such jobs through the platform economy. So I'm sure that he has a lot to share with us with reference to this subject. I'd like to thank Professor KRUEGER for being with us, and I'd like to thank you for listening and having such much. I'd like to give the floor straight to Professor KRUEGER. Thank you.
Grazie, Marco. That's all the Italian I'll use. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I particularly appreciate that you mentioned the Princeton Survey Research Center, because some of the work I'll talk about today is a product of the research that I've done together with my good friend Larry Katz from Harvard, working with the Princeton Survey Research Center. Also want to thank Trento for hosting this festival. I think this is the 4th or 5th time I've come, and there's really nothing like it in the world, where such a distinguished group of economists and other social scientists come and discuss the research to a community that is genuinely interested in learning what researchers are finding. What I'm going to discuss, as Marco mentioned, is often called the sharing economy, and I'm particularly interested in the nature of work in the sharing economy. Sharing economy is not a term I particularly like. It sounds a little bit benevolent, and one could be cynical and say it's really no different than the rest of the economy. And if you think about it, in economics, we like to think there are gains from trade. So really anything that takes place in the economy involves some aspect of sharing. But what I'm going to focus on are various applications or web platforms, internet platforms, where people provide labor services through the web. They somehow use the internet to provide labor services. It could be to find customers, like Uber drivers. Use Uber to find customers, and Uber has many followers and competitors, such as Lyft or Grab Taxi, Didi in China. Could be services such as TaskRabbit, as Marco mentioned, where you can hire someone to babysit for your children or fix a broken fence in your backyard. Could be Grubhub. Grubhub is a service which delivers food from a restaurant right to your doorstep. And there are many other types of services that are cropping up on the web. This goes by a variety of different names. Sometimes it's called the on-demand economy because you just take out your smartphone and you demand a car and it arrives. That's a term I don't like either because you might as well think of it as the on-supply economy, since the workers get to choose whether they want to supply their labor on a particular day. And one of the points I'm going to emphasize is that one way in which the sharing economy differs from the rest of the labor market is that workers have a tremendous amount of discretion to choose when to work, whether to work, or where to work. Sometimes it's called the 1099 economy. That's the tax form that independent contractors receive in the U.S. So I'm going to call it the gig economy, gig jobs. What does that mean? Well, musicians used to talk about performing gigs. They would get hired to perform at a party or at a bar, and then they would go from one gig to the next, from one short job to the next. That's the term that I tend to use. I don't know if that translates to Italian, but I'll call it the gig economy. And Uber, the ride-sharing platform, is the quintessential employer of gig work in the U.S. And let me just summarize what I'll show you in more detail. Perhaps 2/3 of all of the work that's being supplied in the online economy or gig economy in the U.S. is through Uber. Yet when and Uber's been growing remarkably quickly, as I'll show you, but only about 0.5% of all workers in the U.S. are currently providing labor through the gig economy, through some online platform. And many of them are doing it on a part-time basis. Offline gig work, finding small jobs not using a web intermediary like TaskRabbit or Uber, is actually more common than using an online intermediary. But the online intermediaries are growing very quickly and will probably overtake the offline gig work pretty soon. But as mentioned, we are seeing a very quick rise in non-traditional work in the U.S. By non-traditional, I mean people who are supplying labor, but they're not traditional employees. They're not covered by the legal protections that regular employees would receive. They don't get the benefits that regular employees would receive. Examples are independent contractors or freelancers or independent consultants. They're all 1099 workers. We've also had a very rapid rise in contract work. Now, contract workers are traditional employees, but in a non-traditional way. What do I mean by that? Contract work means that one company is contracting out workers to work for another company. And this was particularly common for janitorial services or security guards warehouse workers, and it's now spreading to white-collar occupations, such as payroll processing and legal services. Maybe someday it will also affect economists. And that's the backdrop for what we're seeing in the rise of the sharing economy, and it's one of the reasons why people are very concerned about this rapidly growing segment, given that most of the job growth that we've seen in the U.S. has been in this non-traditional alternative work sector over the last decade. Now, Europe is lagging behind in the sharing economy, and I think that this will have an adverse effect on productivity growth and on the quality of services. Could also affect, for example, the tourism industry if it's not possible to hire an Uber driver or Lyft driver as soon as someone lands in a new city, in a new country. But it also does protect existing workers and existing businesses. I'm going to propose that we extend the social compact to the workers in this emerging sector, and that we tailor the social compact in a way that's appropriate for workers who have the authority to choose when they work and whether they work. And I think that could lead to a more efficient and a more fair outcome. So that's where I'll conclude. So as I mentioned, as a backdrop, this is what's been taking place in the U.S. labor market. This is from a survey that Larry Katz and I conducted at the end of last year, where we implemented the same survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts but hasn't been able to conduct for the last decade, asking workers about their work relationship. Are they independent contractors or consultants or freelancers? Those are the yellow bars. And I should point out, Larry and I didn't make this graph. We took it from the Wall Street Journal, which made a much better graph from our paper than we made ourselves. And you can see that independent contractors went from about 6.5% of the workforce up to 8% of the workforce over the last 20 years. And it's a pretty steady increase. Interestingly, we don't pick this up in a lot of other Bureau of Labor Statistics data. For example, those workers are all self-employed. Yet, according to the BLS data, self-employment has been declining. According to the IRS data, self-employment's been rising. And I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics is missing a lot of workers who are self-employed. I think they're reporting themselves as employees. And in this survey, which is more specific and asks specifically, are you working as an independent contractor, freelancer, independent consultant for your main job, we see this rise. And I put in here, or the Wall Street Journal put in here, workers in the gig economy. That's the 0.5% shaded in at the top. So a lot of the growth in this sector has been taking place independent of what's going on with all of these web platforms that are popping up. It's a trend that's been taking place anyway. Then secondly, I want to point out contract work. We've had an explosion from a low base of workers who are employed by one firm but contracted out to work at another firm. And some of this is a concern because companies used to share some of their profits with their janitors and their security guards, but when those workers are now cabined off and in a separate company, they're paid less because there are fewer concerns about vertical equity when those workers are in a completely separate company. And that's part of the motivation for the rise in contract work. But I think there's another factor that's causing the rise in contract work, and that involves technological change. And you could go back and raise the very important question that Ronald Coase asked over 75 years ago: why do we have firms? Why do companies exist? If we think the market's so efficient, why don't all businesses just reach out to the market and have contracts for everything they need to be done in their business? Why do they hire employees? And employees, the workplace, is kind of an oasis from the market. Commands direct workers. When Princeton wants me to meet with a student, they don't say, we'll pay you an extra $50 this week if you meet with the student during office hours. It's just expected that I hold office hours, and that's part of my job. So Coase came up with an answer, which is, well, it must be efficient for companies to hire workers because they save on transactions costs. Think about how much work it would be if you have to write a contract with your employees for every task they do at work, wouldn't it be better if the understanding was they get paid a regular salary that comes with certain protections, and at the same time they are supervised by their manager? The worker gives up a lot of his or her freedom in exchange for having this regular job, and the transactions costs are what prevent firms from contracting out for every particular service they want performed. That was COSA's explanation. There are other explanations. Oliver Williamson has argued that if a worker has to learn a specific task, then the company can expropriate some of the bargaining power, some of the rents that the worker would receive after learning that task. The firm could be unfair to the worker and say, we're not going to pay you very much, even though you invested very heavily in learning how to use this word processor or this spreadsheet, which nobody else uses because it doesn't do you any good elsewhere. And then thirdly, information is important. And companies have a lot of information about the quality of work that their workers are doing and so on. Now, technology is altering all of those things. One of the beautiful features of Uber is you don't have to negotiate with the driver. You don't even have to take out your wallet. You're charged automatically. The transaction takes place in the background automatically. And the internet technology is reducing transaction costs. Computer and information technology is also making work more standardized. Basically, everyone is using the same word processor or the same spreadsheet. So it doesn't matter if you're working at the contract accounting firm doing payroll for a particular firm. They're all using the same software, and that makes it possible to contract out that type of work. And, of course, the technology helps to monitor performance. And companies like Uber and eBay have rating systems where they're kind of using crowdsourcing in order to provide this kind of general information. So I think this growth in contract work, which is not unique to the U.S., is partly a result of companies looking to save money. They may have felt that they were overpaying some workers in the past, which unfortunately I think is weakening our sense of community within firms. I also suspect it's affecting the quality of work that some workers are doing. But there's also a technological factor that's leading to the rise in contracting out. And we've also seen an increase in workers who are on call. If you're on call, your employer can call you in at the last minute. You don't have a set schedule. And then lastly, a rise in temporary help agency work, where workers, like contract firms, they're working for the temporary help agency, but they're lent out to work at another firm. So I'm going to talk about the dashed lines, but these other trends I think are quite important. And in the U.S. economy over the last 10 years, we've added 9.1 million jobs. These alternative jobs have increased by 9.4 million. So all of the net job growth over the last 10 years has been in this alternative sector. Now, we can't look year by year, and I suspect we're partly seeing the result of the Great Recession. And I have to point this out to be fair to the Obama administration. Since the end of 2009, the U.S. has added almost 15 million new jobs. So I don't want people to leave with the impression that all of the jobs the U.S. economy has been creating in this recovery are in this alternative sector. I think that's not the case. But certainly the trend over the last 10 years has been for the growth of the alternative sector to dominate the job market. So let me focus on the sharing economy. And the Pew Foundation just did a really interesting study where they asked over 4,700 Americans about their familiarity and use of the sharing economy. And what they found was that 70% of Americans have used some type of shared or on-demand online service, but a lot of that is buying stuff from Amazon or eBay, not providing work or purchasing labor services. So if you look at this list, half of Americans have bought goods or secondhand goods online. 41% use programs that offered some same-day or expedited services. A little over a quarter of Americans have purchased tickets online through Ticketmaster or StubHub. 22% have bought artisanal or handcrafted products, and there are actually website sites like Etsy that specialize in homemade products. 22% of Americans say that they've contributed to online fundraising projects. This is a fast-growing area. It's called crowdsourcing. If you haven't heard of Kickstarter or GoFundMe, they're really interesting innovations where if you have a friend who is ill and in need of medical care, or if you have a cause that you want to support, you could put it online and people will make a contribution. And I'm actually personally one of those 22% of Americans who've made such a contribution. None of that has to do with work in the sharing economy. 15% of Americans have taken a ride-sharing service, have taken Uber or Lyft or one of their competitors. Only 15%. And what's remarkable is that Uber is a company that's valued at over $50 billion US today. They have over 450,000 drivers, yet only 15% of Americans have taken this service, which says to me there's a lot of room for it to continue to expand, for this sector of the economy to continue to grow. Used online home sharing services. An example is Airbnb, where you can rent out your home or an apartment, spare room in your home. Many people who are listing units on Airbnb have specifically bought units as an investment, and they're renting them out. This is a service I can tell you I've used many times, including in Cuba, because there were not enough hotel rooms when I visited Cuba. I don't consider this work in the sharing economy, although it is a very important part of the sharing economy, and you'll see a little bit more on that soon. How about ordering groceries from a local store? 6% of Americans have done that. And that's an area where a lot of investment is being made. Uber and Walmart just reached an agreement to have Uber deliver products from Walmart to people in the area. Working in a shared office space. This is really fascinating new development. There's a company called WeWork. WeWork will provide office space for startups, for anybody who's got a small company. They will also provide beer and ping pong tables for entertainment. They'll also provide some services like advice on accounting. And it's one way in which ideas can be incubated very quickly and can expand very quickly. Then you get down to hiring someone online to provide an errand or a task. Only 4% of Americans have used a service like TaskRabbit. And then lastly, renting clothing, other products for a short time online. I never knew you could actually do this until my daughter told me that she was going to a ball and she needed a new dress. She only needed it for one night. So she rented two gowns and she wore one of them, and then the next day she sent them both back. And actually, as that story kind of suggests, young people are more likely to use these services. Also, people with a college degree or higher, people in urban areas are more likely to use these services. Now, if you're confused about what the sharing economy means, you're not alone. Most Americans are confused too. Only 39% of Americans said that they were familiar with the term crowdfunding, which is a way of raising money for a cause online. 27% said they had heard the term sharing economy, and only 11% said they had heard of the gig economy. So you're not alone, and I think this indicates that these are still very early days for the emergence of the online sharing economy. Now, I'm going to focus on work in this sector, and in particular, I'm going to look at workers who I call independent workers. I'll give that a specific, more specific meaning later on. Uber drivers, the taskers on TaskRabbit, the people who provide tasks through TaskRabbit, the delivery people from Grubhub, and so on. They're the independent workers. They get to use the intermediary, the app or platform, to find the customer. So you have this triangular relationship where the app is used to connect the worker to the customer, and the relationship between the worker and the customer is typically fleeting. It's not a enduring relationship. You get a ride from point A to point B, and that's it. Someone comes and they fix your fence, and then that provision of that service is done. And this is typically not a traditional employment relationship. In some sense, the customer is employing the independent worker, and the intermediary is just connecting them and taking typically a commission. Typical commission could be 20% for Uber or for some of the other online apps. So the intermediaries have structured the relationship with the workers as independent contractors, not regular employees, by and large. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but that's been the case by and large. Now, there have been a number of attempts to measure the size of this sector, and they all point to about the same number, around 0.5% of the workforce. These two charts are from a study that was conducted by the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute. And J.P. Morgan Chase, which, as you know, is an enormous banking network, has access to everyone's banking account. They use anonymous records, so don't worry if you bank with J.P. Morgan Chase, you're not identified. And look at the chart on the left and the blue line. That tells you the proportion of the U.S. adult population who received income from one of 30 online platforms. And J.P. Morgan Chase used some analysis I'll show you in a moment from me to identify the 30 largest intermediaries, such as Uber and Grubhub and Lyft. And then they could see if money was being transferred into someone's account from those sources. And what they find is that only 0.4% of the U.S. population, or about 0.6% of the U.S. workforce, on a monthly basis is receiving income from those online intermediaries. So that's their best estimate of the magnitude of this sector. In green, they look at platforms that are used to sell goods or to rent out an apartment, rent out a house, like Airbnb. And you can see that the online platforms for renting goods or selling goods is substantially larger in terms of the number of people who are receiving revenue, but still small. The whole sharing economy represents about 1% of the U.S. population on the supply side, on those who are making money from these endeavors. The right-hand side shows you the cumulative growth, and it's growing like mad. Not so surprising, 47-fold increase in the sharing economy since the end of 2012. And both the labor services and the selling of goods or leasing of goods have been growing at an exponential rate. Thank you. This next chart shows you the number of Uber drivers in the U.S. And Uber is a ride-sharing service. We have a variety of different services through Uber. There's UberX, and this will be very confusing because in Europe, UberX is actually Uber Pop. There's Uber Black, which I think in Europe is often called UberX. That's commercial drivers, licensed drivers who typically have a pretty high-quality car. There's Uber Pool. Uber Pool is a great idea where if you choose Uber Pool, you could carpool with someone else. If you're going from point A to point C and there's somebody in between and point B, you could choose the option where you stop, you pick up that additional passenger. Your fare is less. There's less congestion on the road because of fewer cars on the road. You're using fuel more efficiently. And the driver actually makes more money because he is collecting fares from two customers, even though they're less than if they were using the regular Uber service. So what this shows you in the purple line, in the green line, is the number of Uber drivers each month, those who are providing rides each month. Uber has a lot of people who join, a lot who leave. This is the number who are active each month. And it's up to now 450,000. When this chart was made, it was 400,000. The number of Uber drivers has been more than doubling every 6 months. If this keeps up, every American will soon be an Uber driver. So it has to level off. That's the thing about exponential growth. But it's been remarkable growth. Now, the other line here shows you the number of searches for the term Uber on Google. So if you want to set up an account or if you want to become a driver, you would probably Google the term Uber. And you can see a remarkably strong correspondence between the number of Google searches for the term Uber and the number of Uber drivers. the reason why that's important is we can actually use that to look at Italy. And I'll show you a little bit on that shortly. This chart shows the number of Google searches for other platforms. So it's all indexed relative to Uber at 100. And if you look at this chart, it drops off pretty sharply after Uber. It makes a lot of sense that the number of searches for a competitor of Uber, like Lyft, would tell you about how popular Lyft is compared to Uber. And if you look at the number of searches for Lyft, it's 12% as common as the number of searches for Uber. And that's about right. Lyft is about 12% as large as Uber, so that's about what you would expect. If you look at Grubhub, that's the second most common, 18.5% as frequent searches for Grubhub as there are for Uber. Grubhub is a service that will deliver dinner from a restaurant for you, or lunch. The food won't be as good as if you use the service in Italy. I assure you of that. And then you can look, you see Upwork. Upwork is a company, was the result of a merger between Odesk and Elance, where these are people who freelance, will perform tasks for you online. And there's actually been a fair amount of research on Odesk. Raj Chetty's former colleague, Mandy Pallas, wrote her thesis looking at Odesk, for example. Fiverr. I never heard of Fiverr. My students at Princeton told me, well, what about Fiverr? And I said, well, what about Fiverr? Fiverr, people will provide a task for you at a price of $5. Why $5? I have no idea. And you're allowed to suggest alternative prices. Fiverr's actually doing okay. Thumbtack, people will provide small tasks. Mechanical Turk. Anyone here of Mechanical Turk? A lot of you. Mechanical Turk was set up by Amazon. And that's also a way of getting people to provide services online. I've used Mechanical Turk to get people to fill out questionnaires and to study different wording of questions and to see how it affects people's answers. It's been used a lot in research for that purpose. TaskRabbit, we mentioned. Sidecar is a competitor of Lyft, which is Lyft and Uber, which is not doing too well. Handy, people will provide handy tasks. Cha-Cha is a really good example. Anybody ever hear of Cha-Cha? That's about right. Cha-Cha is now out of business. It was a high flyer. It was on an exponential path. Cha-Cha is a human-based search engine. So if you want to search for something, Cha-Cha sends it, if you have a question, if you're on Jeopardy and you have a lifeline, you can reach out to Cha-Cha. And they had a network of people who would answer the questions. The problem is that Google was so good, there really was no need for Cha-Cha. And it does teach you something, because I think it says that not every company here is going to succeed. And in fact, if you look at this list, it's very similar to what Pew found. Where we're seeing growth and kind of viability in this sector has been in transportation, food delivery, which is related to transportation, and performing small tasks. Okay, I could go on, but let me move to the next slide. This chart is a little bit hard to see, but it shows you Uber X and Uber Black, the number of drivers. And I should also give you a disclosure. Some of the research I'm talking about, including this slide, I conducted together with Jonathan Hall, who is the head of research for Uber, and I was commissioned to work on this fascinating project with Jonathan. So what do you see here? Uber X, which in Europe is Uber Pop, is what is driving the growth of Uber. The exponential growth of Uber is entirely due to Uber Pop. Uber Black is growing linearly. If Uber was limited to Uber Black, it would be a perfectly fine company. I doubt its valuation would be anything close to $50 billion. And I think there's a very important lesson here for Europe, because what is scaling for Uber, and I think it's true in general for ride-sharing, is the low barrier of entry service. Anyone could be an Uber X driver who has a car that's in decent shape and who has a good driving record. One doesn't need to be a commercially licensed driver. One isn't required to have gone through the training that commercially licensed drivers are gone through and to pay the fees that commercially licensed drivers have undergone. And I'll come back to that point. This chart shows you for 20 cities in the U.S. how much Uber has grown since it began. So Uber started late in Miami and Austin and Houston. It started early in Seattle was actually the first city. San Francisco was one of the early cities. Los Angeles, which is sort of tailor-made for Uber, because if you've ever tried to get a taxi on the street in Los Angeles, good luck. And the city is so spread out with so much traffic, it really works quite well for Uber's model. The cities where Uber started later, it has the fastest growth rate. And I think that's related to something that I mentioned earlier, which is people are still learning about Uber. They're still getting the app. And it's spreading very quickly by word of mouth. So by the time Uber opened in Miami, which was only about 3 years ago, it had its fastest growth rate of any American city. And these numbers are quite spectacular. In Los Angeles, there are more Uber drivers than there are taxi drivers now. Since Uber started in Los Angeles, the number of taxi drivers have declined, but not nearly by as much as the number of Uber drivers have been added. And if you look at the total number of trips, adding taxi and Uber as providers, in Los Angeles, they're up about 30–40%. I should have mentioned, because many of you might not have been familiar with Uber or other ride-sharing. Actually, raise your hand if you've taken Uber or ride-sharing ride. Wow. In the U.S., everybody would have raised their hand. So the way that these apps work is that you take out your smartphone and you request a driver, and within 30 seconds, the app finds the closest driver who's willing to provide a ride for you. And you can identify using GPS, which is part of the app, where the driver is in relation to where you are. You can also enter the address where you want to go. You don't have to exchange a word with the driver. The driver could speak a totally different language than you, and the app will tell the driver where to take you. And then the app on the driver's side has GPS, and it gives the driver a route to take you, presumably the fastest route to take you to your destination. The driver has the ability to work for Uber and another company at the same time, or to watch television or take care of his or her kids or run a personal errand while the app is on. The driver can turn down a request for a ride if he or she wants. The driver has 30 seconds once the app tells the driver that you're the closest one to the customer who wants a ride to accept or decline offering the ride service to that customer. And the fees that the rider pays to the driver are all handled through a credit card exchange. The customer is sent an email, basically as soon as the door closes, telling the customer how much he or she was charged for the ride. The bill shows the route that the driver took, when it began, when it ended. The fares vary from city to city. On average, they're about 30% less than what taxi drivers charge, from best I can tell. Then you should also know that Uber has something that's very controversial called surge pricing, which as an economist I think is a great idea. If there's an excess of demand relative to the number of drivers who are available, Uber will raise the price. It's what economists think should happen when you have an imbalance between demand and supply. And the price could go up by a factor of 10. Now, that's intended to bring more drivers to the area, and it's also intended to discourage passengers who really don't need to get to their destination so quickly from using the service. So that is how the market clears, unlike taxis where there's just a constant fare throughout the day typically. This shows you San Francisco, New York, London, and Paris. The number of Uber drivers. They're scaled to population. So you could see exponential growth in San Francisco, pretty good growth in New York and London, and very modest growth of Uber in Paris. Now, I wanted to provide you some information on Italy, and I wasn't able to get that from Uber, but I was able to use Google Trends. So let me describe this chart. And this tells you a little bit about my life also. For the 6 countries that I visited in the last 3 weeks, I got information on the popularity of searching for the term Uber relative to all other searches that people in those countries were doing. So the U.S. is the, I don't know what color you call that, blue, light blue line, second from the top at the end. Singapore, which is purple, has more usage, more intensive use of Uber than in the U.S. Malaysia has its own Uber-like company called Grab Taxi, which is quite successful. It's one of the really interesting examples of an internet startup in Asia. And nonetheless, Uber operates in Malaysia and is doing quite well. Then you can see the UK, thank you. Then you can see the UK, France, and Italy at the bottom. So what I said earlier, I think Europe is moving much more slowly to the sharing economy. I think this is an example. And if European countries don't permit a service like Uber Pop, where a broader set of drivers can enter, I think that you'll continue to see much less usage, and the spread of ride-sharing applications in Europe, I think, will lag far behind Asia and North America if that's the case. Okay, well, what about the drivers? This is such a good deal for the drivers. I think the most important aspect of the market for the drivers is the flexibility that the sharing economy offers. And again, Uber is going to be my quintessential example because it accounts for so much of the sharing economy. 61% of Uber drivers have another job. About half of them have a full-time job and half have a part-time job, which is rather remarkable. Only about 39% of the Uber drivers are driving for Uber and not doing any other paid work. The drivers vary their schedules tremendously from week to week. 65% of the drivers drive either 25% more or 25% less from one week to the next. 40% drive either 50% more or 50% less from one week to the next. That's just the total number of hours. If you look at the particular hours, they vary tremendously. And since I've started working in this area, I've taken to quizzing my Uber drivers about what other work they do. And it just leaps out at you how important the flexibility is. Examples are real estate agents who have some downtime, so they turn on the Uber app. Parents who have to take their children to school and pick them up at a certain time from school, and in between have time available. A building inspector I once met, even a college professor from Rutgers who said, you never know what happens. It's good to be prepared in case you need another career. So the flexibility, I think, is a major factor, and the drivers themselves cite it. 85% of the drivers said that flexibility was a major part of the appeal. A great many of the drivers are doing this at a very low intensity level. 51% are working 15 hours or less per week. And I'll show you a little bit more about their hours distribution, and I'll say a little bit more about their earnings and fees in a moment. So this compares the work hours of Uber drivers in a week to taxi drivers. And a word about taxi drivers is in order. In the U.S., most taxi drivers don't own the car they're driving. In the U.S., most taxi drivers lease the car and the medallion, which is a license to drive the car, from the taxi company or a leasing company. And they typically lease it for a 12-hour shift. So they'll come in and they'll pay, the amount varies, $120, $140, to lease the car for the day. They have it for 12 hours. Well, once they paid that, the marginal cost is pretty low, so they tend to drive long shifts. Uber drivers typically use their own car. Uber has a new service where you can lease a car from Uber at what look to me like reasonably good terms. But most of the drivers are using their own cars. And if you look at the distribution of hours, they're like night and day. So 51% of Uber drivers are working 15 hours or less a week. Only 4% of taxi drivers are driving so little. If you look at 35 hours or more, which we consider to be full-time in the U.S., only 19% of Uber drivers are working 35 hours or more per week versus 81% of taxi drivers. So it's quite different. And the Uber drivers are floating in and out depending upon what other things they have going on in their life, and also depending upon whether they think it's a peak time for being a for-hire driver, whereas the taxi drivers have the car for a very long period of time through the rush hour and through the slow period. There was a study that was done looking at Uber drivers in France, and they looked somewhere in between taxi drivers and the Uber drivers in the U.S. 44% of the Uber drivers in France are working 30 hours or more a week. And I guess in France, 30 hours counts as full-time. That's why it wasn't broken down at 35. So the European country which permits Uber, but only the commercially licensed Uber drivers, that looks a bit more like taxi, and I think that you don't get some of the advantages that I'll describe in a moment in more detail that come with the flexibility from Uber POP drivers. What about their earnings? This turns out to be a pretty controversial topic. We can calculate using Uber's data how much money the drivers make per hour net of Uber's fees. And what are Uber's fees? They're typically a 20% commission that goes to Uber, as well as $1 for every ride, which goes towards providing insurance. I didn't actually know this, so most people don't know that Uber drivers do get insurance from Uber, up to $1 million of insurance, and it's paid for by taking $1 of each ride. We don't know how much money the drivers pay for gasoline. It depends. It depends on the kind of car they're driving. It depends upon how efficient the driver they are. We don't know about the depreciation of the car, which is also important, or the maintenance of the car. There have been a couple of attempts to try to measure the costs. They come to between $3, $5 an hour. So I've shown this with $5 an hour as the cost. It varies from driver to driver. And I'm working on a project trying to get a better measure of what the driver's expenses are. We can compare that to taxi drivers. Now, this is a funny group of taxi and limo drivers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics collects data on taxi and limo drivers who are employees. So it's not your typical taxi driver. It's only about 20% of taxi drivers. But they don't have fees. They're hired to drive somebody else's car. And they make about $13 an hour. So what I take away is that the Uber drivers are earning about as much, perhaps a bit more, than taxi drivers are. That, I think, is something you would expect. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, Uber drivers are using their own car, so they ought to get some return for using their own capital. In addition to being a worker, they also are a capitalist in that sense because they're using their own equipment. In addition, there's pretty easy mobility between being a taxi driver and being an Uber driver. And a lot of taxi drivers moved over to become Uber drivers. I suspect they did that because the flexibility was attractive to them and the compensation was at least as good as what they were making as taxi drivers. I'll say more about earnings in a bit. J.P. Morgan Chase did a fascinating comparison of when it is that people are working in the sharing economy. So as I mentioned before, for Uber drivers and for others in the sharing economy, they're their own boss. They get to choose when they work and whether they work. Many of them work for a month in the sharing economy, and then the next month they don't. I already mentioned many of them work very short period of time, even in that month when they are working in the sharing economy. So what J.P. Morgan Chase Institute could do would be to look at people who supplied services in the sharing economy at some point over a, say, 3-year period, and they could look at what their earnings were from employment in months when they provide labor in the sharing economy, what their earnings were from the sharing economy, and they can compare that to other months when they only worked on a regular job. And what they found was that when workers' incomes dipped from their regular job, they're more likely to supply labor in the gig economy. They're more likely to start to drive for Uber or to provide services in some other, through some other platform. And remarkably, the drop in regular earnings was totally offset, slightly more than offset, by working in the online economy. So to interpret these numbers, in the typical month when someone worked in the online economy, their earnings from a regular job had dropped by 14%. But their earnings from the gig work raised their earnings by 15%. So it slightly offset the loss in earnings from their other work. So in that sense, I think a lot of workers in this sector of the economy are using the opportunity to provide work flexibly to offset negative shocks to other sources of income. And we have a serious problem in the U.S. of very high income volatility from one month to the next or 1 year to the next, and at the same time, inadequate savings for an emergency. American workers have a very low savings rate, and when their income falls, perhaps because they lose a job or because their hours are greatly cut back, that leads to lots of problems. It could lead to foreclosures on their home. It could mean that they have a lot of difficulty getting medical care. Because they don't have a rainy day fund to draw down from, the opportunity to work in the gig economy helps them to smooth their income and therefore smooth their consumption. And I think that's a very important feature of this work, which is not widely appreciated. What about the efficiency of the sector? I was able to get for 5 cities information for taxi drivers and for Uber on how many hours they have their app on or how many hours they're working and what fraction of the time they have a passenger in their car. And I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever I approach a taxi at Newark Airport, you typically put down a book because they spend a lot of time waiting for their next customer. And the numbers are rather remarkable. So for taxi drivers in Boston, only 32% of the time that they're working do they actually have a passenger in their car. For Uber, it's 46% of the time. New York, which is the only place possibly in the world, I think in America at least, where hailing a yellow cab on the street makes sense, there's not much of a difference between the capacity utilization rate, the fraction of time there's a passenger in the car, and between Uber and taxi. And in San Francisco, the cab drivers have a passenger in the car 39% of the time, and Uber has a passenger in the car 54% of the time. This is a very important fact because this explains why it is that Uber can charge their customers 30% less than taxis charge their customers, yet the drivers seem to be getting paid at least as much in Uber as in taxi. And I think this is an indication of the efficiency of the ride-sharing model. I think the app is part of the reason. I don't think it's the only reason. But clearly, the matching algorithm that the map uses is more efficient than calling up a radio dispatcher, having the radio dispatcher get on a two-way radio and contact a taxi driver, or having the taxi circle around looking for a customer. But I think there are other reasons that explain the efficiency here. One is the labor supply model that I mentioned earlier. Taxi drivers have their car during peak hours and during slow hours. Uber drivers know when the commute, when there's the rush hour, and they're more likely to work for Uber at that in those hours, to turn their app on and provide ride-sharing services at those times. There are 2 other reasons that I think explain the greater efficiency of Uber. One is scale. Uber now is larger than the largest taxi companies in just about every city. And there are big scale economies, because if you call up one taxi company, the chance that there's actually a car very close to you is not as great if you called up the largest one, which has cars distributed throughout the area. And Uber also avoids some regulations, which in my judgment are probably very inefficient and not helpful for, certainly not helpful for customers. So for example, if I take a train from New York to Princeton Junction, which happens to be in West Windsor, New Jersey, the taxi driver is licensed by West Windsor when the one who drives me to Princeton University. Princeton University is in Princeton, New Jersey, which licenses a different set of taxi drivers. The driver who took me to Princeton cannot pick up someone at the cab stand and take them back to the train station, even though that's where they may want to go. That kind of regional licensing is very common in the U.S. It's a real problem between Arlington, Virginia, and Washington. If you've ever tried to hail one of those red taxis in Washington and they just drive right by you, that's because they're licensed in Arlington, Virginia, and they're not allowed to pick you up. I also looked at what fraction of mileage that drivers drive, they have a passenger in the car. And these numbers are really remarkable. So Los Angeles is on the left and Seattle on the right. And in Los Angeles, 40% of the miles that taxi drivers are driving, they're driving with the passenger in the car. For Uber, it's 64%. And to interpret those numbers, for every mile that a taxi driver in Los Angeles drives with a customer in the car, he drives 1.5 miles with the car empty. For Uber, for every mile that the driver is driving with the customer in the car, he drives 0.5 mile with the car empty. So if you think about the waste of resources, the burning of fossil fuel, the pollution, and the congestion on the road, there, I think, are clear efficiency gains from the ride-sharing service. What about the effects on the traditional economy? This is meant to depict the reaction of hotels to Airbnb and taxis to Uber. And I think the reaction is a bit different in U.S. and Europe. In the U.S., the taxi drivers are not harmed nearly as much as one might expect from Uber compared to in Europe. In the U.S., the taxi companies are harmed. So what we've seen in the U.S. is that the price of medallions, the taxi license, has plummeted. Even in New York, it's dropped by 1/3. That's a big capital loss for the businesses. Some of the largest ones are going bankrupt. The taxi drivers, however, are in a pretty competitive industry. They're not employees, typically. They're not getting benefits. They are independent contractors like the Uber drivers. So the effects of ride-sharing on the traditional economy, I think, are really quite complicated, and they vary sector by sector. So the way I think about the effects in general equilibrium is that there are 3 potential effects that are important. One is that ride-sharing and these other services have increased the demand for workers with moderate skills. Even in Los Angeles, where Uber has been remarkably successful, the number of drivers is considerably higher than it was before Uber entered. The reason is you've got a more efficient technology, so you have more customers, more trips being provided. That increases the demand, and if there were enough companies like Uber doing that, I think that will help raise wages of all workers with a moderate level of skills. I think at the current scale, where the whole sharing economy is only 0.5% of the U.S. economy, that we're not talking about a major effect yet on the overall level of wages for workers who could provide these services. But that should have a more general positive effect on the position of workers with a moderate level of skills. Secondly, the Uber drivers have very little bargaining power. They are independent contractors with a big company, so they can't dictate the terms of their compensation. Moreover, there's free entry. So basically, anyone can become an Uber driver. So if the compensation is really high, what you would tend to see, and what actually is the case, is a flood of new drivers coming in, and that pushes down the utilization rate. So the earnings per hour actually drop because you have more and more drivers coming in. And then third, an issue which a number of people have been concerned about is the effect of the sharing economy on traditional employees, and in particular, is this going to weaken labor standards? Is the fact that you can now find a janitor through TaskRabbit to fix your plumbing going to mean that plumbers who work for a plumbing company are now facing much stiffer competition? The plumbing company will be less likely to provide benefits, or you're going to have more workers providing plumbing services as independent contractors rather than working as a company where they get the legal protections that employees get. And I think that that is a very legitimate concern. I think we need to look case by case to see how important it is. As I said, in the U.S., at least as far as Uber is concerned, I don't think that's such a risk because the drivers are independent contractors. My PhD student, Judd Kramer, studied the impact of Uber on the wages of taxi drivers across cities. And as I mentioned before, Uber entered some cities late, some early, had a bigger impact in some cities than others. So he looked at the cross-city variation and its impact on the number of taxi drivers and the compensation of taxi drivers. What he found was that as Uber entered a city, the number of taxi drivers fell, but their wages actually remained pretty steady. He didn't find an impact on wages, which again is consistent with the view that the taxi drivers were not being paid particularly well to start with. Their wages were determined at pretty close to a competitive level. Now, one last point that I want to emphasize is that policy can shape the emergence of this sector for both good and bad. Policy could choke it off, and policy can make it more compatible with our existing employment system. I think that there are lots of exciting opportunities here, but I think we don't want to jeopardize the 99.5% of workers who, well, it's not quite that high. In the U.S., call it 85% of workers who have traditional jobs and who benefit from a social compact that's evolved over a century that provides essential benefits and protections to workers. So what I've been working on together with Seth Harris, who was Deputy Labor Secretary and is a labor lawyer, is a proposal to create a new category of workers, a new legal classification of workers who would get many of the benefits of the social compact, but the ones that make sense for them. So we would be very careful to tailor the benefits that workers in this sector receive so that we maintain the flexibility for the workers to come in and choose their own hours and work whether they want, yet at the same time make it so that they receive important protections that employees receive. This will help protect the social compact for traditional employees. I think it will also improve the working conditions and the lives of the independent workers who are supplying services through the online platforms. And where we are now is, I think, not an optimal situation. Our labor laws currently are very obsolete when it comes to this new sector. And what we have in mind are independent workers. What makes the independent workers different than traditional employees is that, like small businesses, they get to choose when they work, whether they work. But the intermediary, the company like Uber, still exerts some control. For example, they could exclude them from using their platform if they think they're not doing a good enough job. So I said our current labor laws are obsolete. What do I mean by that? Well, in the U.S., we have two classifications of workers. They're independent contractors or they're traditional employees. We have many different labor laws. We have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which requires overtime premium and minimum wage. We have ERISA, which refers to health care and pensions that companies provide and regulates those benefits for employees. The IRS, which withholds income taxes and determines whether the company needs to pay half of the social insurance contribution for employees, or if someone's an independent contractor, they're responsible for paying both halves of the social insurance contribution. National Labor Relations Act, which is labor law. Civil Rights Act, which is protection against discrimination. I can go on and on. We have all of these separate labor laws. They use their own standards for defining who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. They're not identical. They're not aligned. And that is creating a legal mess for a number of reasons. We're seeing court cases being brought against the intermediaries, the platforms like Uber, in a number of jurisdictions under a number of laws. And it's quite conceivable that under some of the laws, the workers will be ruled to be employees, and under some they'll be ruled to be independent contractors. Or in some jurisdictions, in some states, under the same law, you could get a discrepancy in the rulings. Now, That's not in anyone's interest, I think. It creates a lot of confusion. It could potentially stymie innovation. So what Seth Harris and I do is to propose that we have this new legal category of independent workers. What defines them is that they get to choose when they work, whether they work, if they work at all, where they work. They often use their own equipment. The intermediary, the company that's matching them to the customers, exerts minimal control. Some control, no doubt. Like they can, we would say they'd be able to set the fares. They'd be able to set the amount that the customer pays, but they don't schedule the workers' hours. They don't tell them exactly how to do their jobs. The worker has a lot of discretion. And once we define this class, which, by the way, doesn't have to work through an online intermediary. There are offline intermediaries. Anyone ever buy or hear of Avon? Michael Berta has probably purchased Avon products, but his mother has. Avon goes door to door and sells beauty products. It's offline. It's a very old company. Functionally, they're doing the same thing as in that triangular relationship. You have this intermediary between the workers and the customer gets the money from selling the product and pays a commission. And there are others like that. In fact, taxi drivers are like that, where they are using a traditional dispatch system and the taxi company is between them. So what would we do? We would extend much of the labor protections that regular employees have to these workers, but we would be careful to keep the fixed costs low, because if the fixed costs are high, then the intermediary is not going to benefit from workers coming in for a short period of time. They would prefer to schedule the workers for longer hours. So what does that mean in practice? I think most importantly, we would allow the workers to form an employee association and bargain with the intermediary. That's something the intermediaries initially didn't like all that much. We would extend civil rights protection. Amazingly, to me, there's very little protection against independent contractors when it comes to discrimination. It's okay to discriminate against an independent contractor. It's legally permitted to discriminate against an independent contractor based on race. Based on sex, based on ethnicity. There's a very limited protection that goes back to the 19th century based on race. The Civil Rights Act is much stronger protection, so we would just extend the Civil Rights Act to independent contractors in this type of an arrangement. We would have the intermediary do tax withholding, which would improve our tax system. We would require the intermediary to pay for half of social insurance contributions. We would require the intermediary to make a contribution towards health care or towards the health care exchanges, because otherwise one can make the argument that they're free riding on the worker's other employer who's providing health insurance. Now, some of these costs would get shifted to the workers in the long run. I think that's the economics of it, but probably not all of it. There's some benefits we would not provide. Time and a half for working more than 40 hours a week. If workers get to choose their own hours, they don't need protection against an employer who's going to schedule them to work 50 hours in a week. They get to make that decision themselves. Unemployment insurance. It's very hard to see cases where workers in this sector would actually qualify to receive unemployment benefits in the U.S. because they're not laid off in the traditional sense. They're choosing whether they work or whether they don't work. The most controversial thing we proposed was to exempt these workers from the minimum wage. And anyone who's familiar with my work knows that I'm not actually opposed to the minimum wage. I think it's actually conceptually very difficult to implement a minimum wage for these workers. If you can work for Uber and Lyft at the same time, who's paying the minimum wage? You have both apps on while you're waiting for a customer to call on you. How do you allocate responsibility for the minimum wage? Moreover, it could be that you're actually doing a personal task and you're reading a book, and you're really mostly enjoying leisure or you're doing personal tasks. The apps are not supervising the workers to that extent that it feels to me that the minimum wage is justified. Now, I think that having a labor union also solves this problem, because the union can negotiate, say, for fees per mile driven or something like that as an alternative. So let me just conclude by saying we think we could structure our labor laws in a way that's appropriate for independent workers who get to choose their own hours. We can have a more efficient system. What really struck me when I talked to some of the companies in this area is they said, we would like to do more for the workers. We would like to provide more benefits, like life insurance, which the workers want. We would like to provide car insurance, auto insurance. We would like to provide more portable retirement benefits. But if we do that, the way the labor law is written, we're much more likely to be judged to be an employer because that's one of the factors that's considered. So even though there are big efficiencies from a company like Uber using its scale and its pooling advantages to provide different forms of insurance to workers, they're not doing it. And I think that's a loss to the economy. So we would allow portable benefits. And I think that's kind of the lowest hanging fruit, and there's a lot of support for portable benefits for workers in this area, but that's one easy thing to do. We would be neutral with respect to employment status so that companies would not want to take regular employees and turn them into independent workers. For one thing, they gain a lot more from turning them into independent contractors today, where they get out of the entire social compact. But for another thing, they would have to relinquish a tremendous amount of control. I don't know too many companies who would say to their workers, come to work when you want. It's up to you. You don't even have to tell us. I can't imagine my university doing that to the faculty, although many of them think that that's already part of their contract. And as I mentioned, it doesn't matter whether you use the technology or not. Conceptually, it's the same type of a triangular relationship. So let me just conclude. Where are we in our proposal? Senator Mark Warner, who is one of my heroes in the U.S. Senate, discussed our proposal, and he said, we had such a perfect compromise, we managed to piss off all sides. No one is quite ready for compromise yet. The labor unions think that these workers should be ruled to be employees. So far, they've lost a lot more cases than they've actually won, and the workers haven't gained very much. The companies believe that they're employees. But interestingly, in a number of lawsuits, the settlement has been moving in the direction of what we proposed. For example, Uber has voluntarily agreed to meet with employee associations in California and Massachusetts of their drivers. They agreed in New York, without even a lawsuit, to work with the machinists union to set up an employee organization for the drivers. Now, the legal status of those organizations is a little bit uncertain because antitrust laws may prevent them from being implemented. So I think we're in very early days of the sharing economy. It's growing extremely rapidly. Eventually, I think it will grow in Europe. But so far, I think European authorities have managed to greatly slow this segment of the economy. I think it's creating lots of exciting opportunities for customers, for businesses, and for workers. And I think it's also bringing some risks. And I think it's up to us, collectively, to design policies so that the growth of the sharing economy works for everybody. And then the final point I want to make, which I think is particularly relevant for Italy, is that progress requires disruption. If you think about what brings about productivity gains, it has to be the case that we could do more with less, that we have to be able to disrupt certain sectors. And disruption is painful, but ultimately that's how productivity increases and how societies grow. And I think it's very important that we tailor our policies so that we humanize this type of disruption, so that the hardship that it inflicts is minimized, so that we get the benefit of the productivity gains and at the same time can protect the existing social compact and protect the most vulnerable. So why don't I stop there, and I hope I left time for questions.
But I want to give you good news, because when you were flying from Vietnam to Italy, the European community made an opening toward the sharing economy, saying that we should open room for the new sectors and to limit it as much as possible regulation on non-necessary, and to forbid these services only in very special limited cases. So there is a new orientation of the European community to open the door to the sharing economy. That's very important. Abbiamo scoperto tante cose da questa presentazione, da questa.
We've discovered many things hearing this lecture by Professor
Tra le
KRUEGER.
quali alcune cose molto interessanti.
Many interesting things. For example, we've learned that the sharing economy is not going to replace anything, but it's just going to increase demand. In the case, for example, of the growth of Uber, we've seen a much greater growth of Uber that was not compensated or offset by the reduction in taxi drivers. And this is important. There's a growth in demand. This means that there should be any access barriers. This is a problem in certainly Europe and in Italy even more so. We haven't talked about the fact that the digital technologies enable us to adopt control mechanism also of reputation of those providing services and buying such services. That was what the taxi medallion should have done, in that once you basically act as a lawyer, you enter into an association, and the association in a way guarantees that you are able to perform such services. But now, thanks to the reputation ranking, we basically get the same guarantees, and the sharing economy also becomes a great stabilizer in terms of wages, because it is more active when regular employment declines. So these are certainly aspects that make the sharing economy very attractive to us. Unfortunately, there's not much time available. I think that we can have at least 10 minutes for our Q&A. So short question if you can. There's a girl here asking for the floor, another guy in the back.
Short question, short answer.
Very fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Credit and taxation. I was wondering if you had the opportunity to see what does this new independent worker model means for the ability of these individuals to get credit from the banks, and also taxation's ability to capture income tax and corporate tax and social security tax. Thank you.
Thank you. So intanto we can get a few questions. C'è un ragazzo lì dietro, poi un signore e poi una ragazza qui. Abbiamo 4 domande e poi rispondiamo.
Posso fare la domanda in italiano?
Yes.
Can you answer my question in Italian? Yes, that's the answer.
Quindi Uber sta crescendo moltissimo.
So we learned that Uber is growing incredibly, but based on what I know myself,
sta incrementando anche il debito che ha.
it is also growing, its debt is growing, it is not gaining. It lives on investment. There are many companies investing on Uber. Is it bringing about a true disruption in the market? Increasing its debt, its leveraging so much. Don't you think that when it reaches as much as 50% of the market, it may exploit the drivers? Hand on the mic to the gentleman before you. Good afternoon. I wanted to ask a question concerning drivers. You were talking about a new category of workers that may be identified with a new category, again, also of legal protections. I have learned about these new technologies. I know about Uber, but I know there are also services that replace man, Uber car, drones, and all these other services have one major objective in the next decade or two. Probably they're going to replace man altogether. How do you think? How long do you think that we're going to be protected, that our jobs are going to be protected for?
So I live in Berlin for 1.5 years, and I used to rent out my room until the organization asked me to stop because the labor mobility in Europe and the US is totally different. And then also Europe has much more labor protection in the US, while Uber and Airbnb boom in China and in the US because labor protection in China and US is not as strong as it is in Europe. So how do you balance, say, the taxi protecting the no-code industry, and then using the new app and then creating the new generation of independent workers, even though I know it is possible to work as an independent worker in Berlin, but it's not generally acceptable in the European system.
Thank you. C'è una domanda qui e poi rispondiamo.
And then why don't I answer it?
Yeah.
Hello, congratulations. Going back to the value of the company, I would like to know how much you think the value of the data that are being accrued over Uber is going to be part of the discussion. My impression is that getting all the data is how people move around and setting the standards worldwide and being able to be the one that could deliver additional services like other platform businesses we know very well. It's going to be probably the real plus of Uber, right? It's only probably part of the value, in my opinion, how much they can scale.
Okay, so very quickly, I haven't done much on credit, although I do know that Uber has a plan to help the drivers purchase a car, which is more advantageous than if you wanted to go through a bank on your own. And the reason why Uber can do that is they directly take the fees, and a portion of it goes to the financing company. The thing about the sharing economy, which I think is important, particularly in Italy, is it's above ground. It's recorded. It's not a cash economy. And in a lot of areas like home repair, it is under the table, part of the black economy. So I think there's the potential for the sharing economy to improve tax enforcement. Where I think in the U.S. there's a risk is we know that the biggest tax gap occurs for small businesses, independent contractors, partly because they don't do a very good job doing tax planning. So at the end of the year when they need to write a check, they're not prepared to do it, which is one of the reasons why I think tax withholding is very important innovation. By the way, one of the most remarkable things about tax withholding is it was invented by Milton Friedman during World War II when he worked at the Treasury Department. And I don't think most people would associate anything having to do with improving tax collection with Milton Friedman. The valuation of Uber, which I don't want to get into too much detail on, a lot of private companies have invested equity in Uber, and I think they've done so because they think it's a very profitable model. Unlike many internet companies, Uber does make a profit in many cities and many countries. My understanding is in China they're not particularly profitable because they have a lot of competition from Chinese companies, and they're investing very heavily to grow in China, probably at the cost of a fair amount of profit. But in the U.S., my understanding is that they are extremely profitable on a cash flow basis. And there are companies in the internet world which have never made a profit. Amazon's a really good example of a company that has an extremely high valuation and always loses money. Now, I think if Amazon wanted to, it could raise its prices and make more money, but I think it's still kind of growing its business, and that's been its strategy all along. I don't think leverage is a problem for a company like Uber, since it's mostly using equity. The question about if Uber gets bigger, more than half the market, which it probably already is, will it exploit the drivers? I think it's limited in its ability to exploit the drivers because it needs the drivers. And if it exploited the drivers, then drivers would leave and they would provide a less good service. And in some sense, what Uber's incentives are is to maximize revenue. And one of the reasons why I think having an employee association is so important is that the association could bring some concerns to the company, which are in both the interest of both the workers and of the company. The question arose about driverless cars, which I think is a very good one, and it may be in 10 years we look back and we say, well, why did we have this session at all? Robots are providing these services. I'm very excited about the prospect for driverless cars, because if you think about where productivity growth will come from, and productivity growth has been remarkably weak, we've actually faced the opposite problem of machines replacing workers, especially in Italy, which has had weaker productivity growth than the U.S. The problem that we've had is that we haven't had enough demand and enough GDP. But so far, in the U.S., we've been hiring more and more workers to produce less and less, given our productivity numbers. I'm not worried about the future being one where there's no work at all. I say that for a couple of reasons. For one thing, people have worried about that for centuries, and it hasn't been realized, but maybe now the technology is so different that it will replace even white-collar jobs. I'm still skeptical. For one thing, I think we could see work hours decline. And when countries and economies function well and productivity rises, we take some of the gains of productivity growth in shorter work hours. One of the problems in the U.S. is that we haven't seen work hours come down in spite of the economic growth that we've had over the last quarter century. And I think public policy has failed us there. I think we should actually have more of a overtime premium to bring. I think we should lower the threshold for overtime to bring down work hours. And then in addition, if the economy functions well, we come up with new services for people. And if you think about the technology now, we have the technology to replace most restaurant workers. I mean, I don't need to order a cappuccino from someone. There are machines that make me cappuccinos, but still Starbucks employs lots of people because part of the service that one is buying is the person behind the counter. The grocery store around the corner from here in Trento dispenses water and other products through a machine on the outside of the building, which I was surprised by the range of products. But even so, there are a lot more products inside and people working inside, because I think the human interaction is valuable, even in situations where we currently have the technology to replace a large number of workers. The situation with Airbnb and kind of the regulations of the sector, I think we need to think really carefully about. I think Airbnb is a great innovation. On the other hand, if Airbnb avoids paying occupancy taxes, which hotels have to pay, that's giving Airbnb an unfair advantage. If Airbnb rental units don't have well-marked fire exits or are not safe, then I don't think that's in society's interest. So I think we need to think long and hard about the regulatory protections that are in society's interest. What gives me pause and makes me enthusiastic about the sharing economy is that there are a lot of regulatory requirements that are just barriers to entry that protect incumbents without serving the broader good. And in the U.S., as well as in many other countries, we've had a proliferation of occupational restrictions, making it harder and harder for someone to go into a profession. Beauty parlors in the U.S., in order to cut someone's hair, you need a license. Well, that's okay. And you can see why. You don't want someone to cut your ear off when they give you a haircut. But the person who washes your hair in the U.S. is required to have a license. And I can tell you, I wash my hair every morning and never had risk of an accident without any training at all. So I think it's kind of run amok. And the ability for online companies to kind of come in and disrupt that, I think, is actually healthy for society, because those regulations have proved very, very difficult to go back and say, do we need this now with changes in technology? Do we really need these kinds of barriers to entry? Then the last question about the data is a very interesting one, and I think the data is extremely valuable. I suspect it's not being used to its fullest extent yet. And we're learning lots and lots of things. For example, the ride sharing is combined with public transportation. We're seeing people get picked up from subway stops and train stations, and it's actually complementing existing public transportation. It can be used to make much better maps, because think about all the data that's generated by the routes that the cars are taking. I think one has to balance the benefits of analyzing the data with the the needs for privacy. and personal security, and I think that's a difficult issue. I could tell you when I worked with Uber, they had different databases, and the research team was not allowed to merge their data into from one database to another. And in fact, with the survey that we did of the drivers, the Uber employees were not allowed to actually have the microdata. I was the one who had access to the microdata. So they do have some walls that are set up, but I think it's very important that companies are explicit about that and transparent about it.
A proposito di alcune domande che sono state fatte, vorrei aggiungere e chiedere io una precisazione.
Now, if I may, I would like to ask a question myself. I would like to ask Mr. Krueger. Now, one of the problems connected to sharing economy could be exploitment, as in the case of Airbnb. It's been said they don't pay occupancy taxes. It could be unfair competitions towards hotels, hotel chains. Now, if all the transactions are digitalized, are digital, and they are all traceable, so they are all connected, so all the tax obligations are complied with, everything is regular, all the operations are traceable, can be identified, so maybe there's a clear relationship between the two things, that we can have an improvement between, let's say, a cashless society and a fairness, as it were, of the sharing economy.
I completely agree with that. I think what it's going to require is carefully crafted regulations so that we're collecting the information we need for the enforcement of the rules to balance the competition. One doesn't want to give this emerging sector an unfair advantage. And I think the fact that it's generating so much data is going to help our authorities in a number of enforcement areas.
Thank you. Io prenderei altre 2 domande se ci sono e poi...
Now I think we have time for a couple of more short questions, please. 2 more and then we have to finish.
Leaving aside Uber, do you think that the largest tech companies that accumulate big profits and basically they have a lot of cash without paying quite any taxes, do you think that the regulators, the global regulators, are taking seriously the possibility to apply a global tax or in any case tackle this situation? Thank you.
C'è un signore subito dietro, sì.
Faccio la domanda in italiano, non sono molto sicuro di quello che sto per chiedere.
Now, I will ask my question in Italian. I'm not sure about what I am about to ask. Anyway, I'll try. Now, I am an organizer of cultural events. I work in the culture industry. I organize events. And a very common, widespread problem is how to evaluate cooperation contributions when organizing an event, in the sense that the event, what is earned, what is gained, is difficult to share, to spread between those who contributed. So maybe a sharing economy. We have a subject, organizing a cultural event or any other type of exhibition requiring the contribution of many different people. Maybe a triangular scheme like yours with a consumer, an intermediary and a worker, maybe using a virtual type of currency, for instance, so that we give value to these contributions, to these tasks that are very difficult to assess. Sometimes you contribute maybe with half an hour, some people do something on Facebook, some people do something in terms of graphics, do some advertising, but it's difficult. You end up with a final benefit and it's difficult to know how much should be given to whom. One last question here in the front row. And then we really must finish. Now, my question is the following. The expansion potential of the sharing economy and the net economy in the financial sector that obviously plays the major role in the current world. Now, besides crowdfunding, there are other startups that are dealing with banking services, those who can lend money, are matched with those who need to borrow money at much lower interest rates compared to traditional banks. I think that could be interesting competitors to traditional banks. What do you think? One last question.
Thanks for this great presentation. I learned so much. I took notes, more notes. I haven't taken as many notes since I was in grad school. But you commented on unions, and I just wanted to have your personal opinion on it. What kind of chance would unions have in this environment? Richard Freeman has made many comments, predictions. They've all been wrong. I mean, it'd be nice to see him be wrong, you know, in the right way. In other words, have some sort of resurgence of organized labor.
Thank you.
Okay. So the question about taxation, I think, is a very important one. And I think the way I interpret it is, leaving Uber aside, because I don't really know about Uber's tax position, and I suspect it's relatively difficult for Uber to shift its revenue to low tax jurisdictions. The U.S. corporate tax code in general is just terrible. When I put together the economic report of the president a few years ago, we had a table which showed that the amount of revenue that American companies the amount of profit that American companies are reporting for Bermuda is 8 times the GDP of Bermuda. Now that suggests that there's a fair amount of clever shifting of income to a country where the income really was not earned. And the European tax systems tend to be better than the American. The territorial systems that you have in Europe, by and large, is essentially what Europe has done is to switch from corporate income tax to value-added tax. And in the U.S., we haven't done that. Our corporations are probably at a disadvantage compared to Europe, but we give them all kinds of loopholes. So they pay relatively little tax, yet face a high marginal tax based on the statutory tax rate. So there's a lot of ground for improving our income tax system. And there are lots of examples of companies like Apple, which is a tech company, of shifting its income abroad. And I do favor, for the U.S., having a minimum tax on global income. And that's something that the president has proposed. There was a proposal in Congress that wasn't too far off by David Camp in the House Ways and Means Committee. And Paul Ryan, I think, blocked that from coming to a vote because Ryan was scheduled to be the next chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. That didn't quite work out since he got a better job as Speaker of the House. I think there's ground for compromise on corporate tax reform in the U.S., which would lead to a more efficient system. I'm not very optimistic after having spent 4 recent years in Washington that our politics are going to lead to that outcome, but I think that there are lots of ways of improving corporate tax system. Independent of the tech sector, it's kind of a more general problem. On the organization of cultural events, and it's related to the last question from Michael Berta, I think there's an enormous potential for using social media for organizing. And traditional labor unions in the U.S. have been extremely slow to take advantage of it. One of the problems I think we've had is that traditional labor unions in the U.S. want to operate on a 1950s model, and that's not where the economy has been heading, and that's one of the reasons why labor unions in the private sector represent only 6% of American workers. But there have been some innovations. One I would highlight is the Freelancers Union, which was set up by Sarah Horowitz, who was an old classmate of mine. She wouldn't like the use of the word old. She was a classmate of mine in college, where she has formed an association to represent freelance workers and to help legislation to protect them. For example, in New York, there was recent legislation that was passed which said that freelancers need to be paid within a certain amount of time. Because one of the problems that they have is that the contractor delays and delays. Sadly, one of the presidential candidates in the U.S. was a prime offender of this type of behavior. And I think that this law is an example of the kinds of thing that this type of a remote association can achieve, in addition to providing some low-cost benefits like insurance. So there are some regulatory hurdles that she faces, but where she's been remarkably successful is in using social media to expand. And she's formed the fastest growing union in the U.S., and she's actually grown at a slower rate than she could because she wants to make sure that there aren't glitches along the way. And I think that there's a lot of potential here for similar types of associations. They may look different than the Steelworkers Union or the Teachers Union, but I think they'll potentially provide a very important service. Peer-to-peer lending, banking. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I really worry about the risk. And so far, it's still quite small. Banking is banking, in my view, and banks are subject to runs. We kind of learned throughout our history that you need deposit insurance for banks, that you need prudential regulation, you need to prevent banks from taking excessive risks. And peer-to-peer lending strikes me as subject to all of those problems if it doesn't fall under the same regulatory umbrella as traditional banking. And so far, it also seems to me that the traditional banking system has played a pretty big role in peer-to-peer lending. Probably the largest one, the Lending Club in the U.S., who's purchasing the packaged up securities? It tends to be traditional banks, and it may be that a bank, since that particular service ran into some problems recently, it may be that a major bank plays a larger role in providing equity or taking it over in the future. So I worry about the peer-to-peer model because I think it's awfully difficult to evaluate credit risk, and I worry about the ability of people who don't have particularly good training in that area or a track record in that area becoming involved.
Grazie ad Alan KRUEGER per questo bellissimo pomeriggio.
Thank you, Professor KRUEGER, for spending this afternoon with us, and thank you very much to you all for staying with us. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.